The mockery begins. The alien mercenaries landed on the human colony with the confidence of a predator that had already won. They did not sneak in, they did not approach with caution, and they certainly did not believe they needed to be careful. To them, humanity was nothing more than a primitive species, a race barely capable of space travel, a people who had no business resisting the might of the galaxy's most feared warriors. They walked with arrogance, their boots sinking slightly into the dry soil of the colony's main outpost, their weapons glowing with deadly energy, their armored bodies reflecting the pale sunlight above. One of them, a massive creature with thick reptilian skin, laughed as he kicked over a human food stand, sending fresh fruits rolling into the dirt. "This is what they call a colony," he sneered, his voice full of contempt. "I have seen insect nests with more defense than this." Another mercenary, smaller but quicker, snorted as he picked up a human-made rifle from a fallen security guard. The weapon was old, its metal scratched from years of use, its design simple compared to the sleek, plasma-based technology the aliens carried. "Look at this pathetic thing." The alien chuckled, waving the rifle in the air. "They still use projectile weapons. How outdated. How amusing." The rest of the squad burst into laughter, their deep voices echoing through the empty streets. The humans of the colony had already surrendered, their hands raised, their faces filled with fear. They had heard the stories of what happened when alien mercenaries arrived, and they knew fighting back would mean certain death. Their weapons were weak, their defenses limited, their hope almost non-existent. Almost. Because one man was still out there. One man had not surrendered. One man had not accepted defeat. Sergeant Cole crouched inside a half-destroyed building at the edge of the colony, watching the invaders with sharp, unblinking eyes. His heart pounded in his chest, but not with fear, with anticipation. He had seen wars before, had fought against enemies who thought they were invincible, had faced those who believed humans were weak, and every single time, he had shown them why they were wrong. His hands tightened around the grip of his weapon, a minigun, an old but powerful piece of human engineering. 6 rotating barrels, capable of firing 3,000 rounds per minute. A weapon not designed for precision, but for absolute destruction. A weapon that did not care about energy shields, did not hesitate before cutting down entire squads, did not stop until there was nothing left to shoot. Cole had dragged the heavy weapon across the colony, setting up his position near the central square, where the mercenaries were laughing at the humans. He could hear their cruel jokes, their arrogant voices, their complete lack of fear. It was always the same. These invaders had never seen true war. They had never fought humans who were truly prepared. They had never faced the full power of humanity's determination. That was about to change. A particularly large alien stepped forward, his armor gleaming under the sun. He raised his plasma rifle and aimed it at an elderly man who had been too slow to kneel. "This is what happens to those who disobey," the alien said, grinning as he prepared to fire. Cole exhaled slowly, his finger resting on the trigger. The moment the plasma weapon began to charge, the silence was shattered by a sound none of the mercenaries had ever heard before, a deep, mechanical roar, a whirring of spinning barrels, a growl of impending destruction. It was the sound of death. And then, in the blink of an eye, the storm began. The minigun came alive, sending a relentless barrage of bullets tearing through the air. The first shots ripped through the large alien's chest before he even had time to scream, his body shredded apart in an instant. The other mercenaries barely had time to register what had happened before the bullets found them too. Piercing armor, slicing through flesh, turning arrogance into pure terror. The laughter stopped. The jokes ended. And in their place, there was only the sound of war. Cole didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. He kept firing, the minigun spitting out thousands of rounds, the colony square turning into a battlefield in mere seconds. The mercenaries who had mocked human weapons, who had laughed at Earth's old technology, now found themselves unable to move, unable to react, unable to survive. Some tried to run. They didn't make it far. Some tried to fight back. Their energy weapons barely had time to charge before they were gunned down. Some simply stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening, unable to accept that a single human was tearing through them like they were nothing. Cole's face remained emotionless as he reloaded. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. And by the time it was, the entire galaxy would know the truth. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and gunpowder. Smoke rose from the bodies of the fallen mercenaries, their once proud armor now riddled with holes, their advanced energy shields shattered like fragile glass against the sheer force of human firepower. The minigun barrels glowed red-hot, still spinning slowly as Sergeant Cole surveyed the destruction he had caused. The colony square, which had been filled with cruel laughter minutes ago, was now silent, except for the faint, broken groans of the few mercenaries who had somehow survived the initial onslaught. They were crawling, bleeding, gasping for breath, their arrogant expressions replaced by something new. Something Cole had seen in the eyes of many enemies before. Fear. Cole moved forward, his boots crunching against the dirt and shattered armor plating beneath him. His minigun was heavy in his grip, but he held it steady, ready to fire again at a moment's notice. He was not done. Not yet. A young colonist, barely in his 20s, peeked out from behind a supply crate, his face pale with shock. His hands were still raised, as if he was waiting for a mercenary to punish him for moving. But there were no mercenaries left standing. Only bodies. Only silence. Cole turned his head slightly. "Get the others," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Tell them it's safe to move." The young man hesitated, then nodded quickly before running toward the other hiding civilians. One by one, heads began to peek out from doorways, from alleyways, from makeshift hiding spots. The people who had feared for their lives only moments ago now stared at the lone soldier who had turned their execution into a massacre. One of the injured mercenaries groaned loudly, trying to push himself up with trembling arms. His reptilian face twisted in pain, his once proud armor dented and useless. His plasma rifle lay a few feet away, too far to reach. But still, he dared to look up at Cole, his breath ragged, his voice shaking. You are a monster," the alien wheezed, his golden eyes filled with pain and terror. "Your kind is not supposed to be this strong." Cole stepped closer, his gaze cold. "You thought we were weak," he said simply. The mercenary bared his teeth, struggling to lift himself, but his injuries were too severe. He coughed, thick blue blood dripping onto the ground beneath him. "We were told humans were no threat. We were told you would surrender." His voice was barely above a whisper now, his energy fading with every breath. "We were wrong." Cole tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, you were." The minigun roared once more, cutting off any last words the mercenary might have had. The body fell lifeless to the ground, another reminder of what happened when enemies underestimated humanity. The colony was still eerily quiet. The civilians who had once cowered were now watching him with wide eyes, not in fear, but in awe, in disbelief, in realization. One of the older colonists, a woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice filled with equal parts gratitude and shock. Cole exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension in his muscles. "Sergeant Cole, Earth's Special Forces." His eyes scanned the gathered crowd. "And I need all of you to listen carefully." The colonists waited, their breath held, their fear now turning into something else. Hope. Cole's voice was steady, controlled, but beneath it there was an unmistakable promise of war. This was just the beginning. He pointed toward the bodies, toward the now empty sky, where the mercenaries' dropships had landed. They thought they could take this colony without a fight. They thought humanity would kneel. His grip tightened on his weapon. They thought wrong. A murmur spread through the crowd. quiet at first, but growing with every second. The people who had once accepted their fate were now looking at each other, at the remains of their enemies, at the human soldier who had saved them with nothing but pure firepower. A man from the back stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Are they going to send more?" he asked. Cole nodded grimly. "Yes. And soon." Another colonist, a woman with dust-covered clothes and a defiant glare, stepped beside the man. "Then what do we do?" Cole looked around at their faces, at the survivors who had just seen the impossible happen before their eyes. He knew what was coming. He knew the next wave would be bigger, stronger, angrier. And he knew there was only one way to make sure this colony didn't fall. His voice was cold, determined. "We fight." Silence. Then, one by one, the colonists started to nod. And somewhere in the vastness of space, the enemies of humanity had no idea that their nightmare had only just begun. The colony was no longer silent. What had once been a place of fear and submission was now alive with movement, voices rising as civilians scrambled to prepare. The people who had spent years bending under the weight of oppression were now standing taller, their eyes burning with something they had not felt in a long time: defiance. Sergeant Cole stood in the center of it all, his mind calculating every possibility, every weakness in their defenses, every advantage they could use. He had fought in countless battles. But this was different. This wasn't a trained military force he was leading. These were farmers, engineers, merchants, ordinary people who had never held a weapon in their lives. And yet, as he watched them arm themselves with whatever they could find, he saw something far more dangerous than experience. He saw determination. A young woman approached him, gripping a plasma rifle taken from one of the fallen mercenaries. "I don't know how to use this," she admitted, her voice steady, but her hands shaking slightly. Cole took the weapon from her, inspecting it before handing it back. "Point, aim, squeeze the trigger. You'll learn the rest fast." She nodded, her fear slowly fading. Nearby, a group of men and women were reinforcing the colony's perimeter with whatever materials they could find. Metal sheets, overturned supply crates, even salvaged armor from the dead mercenaries. It wasn't much, but it would slow the enemy down. An older man approached, his wrinkled face hardened by years of hardship. "We don't have enough weapons," he said. "Only a handful of rifles from the ones you killed. The rest of us have tools, knives, some old hunting weapons." Cole met his gaze. "Then we use what we have." The man frowned. "And when they come back, they'll have more soldiers, more guns, more ships." Cole's expression remained unreadable. "Good." The old man blinked. "Good." Cole's voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "They won't expect a fight. They'll come here thinking we're weak, just like last time. We use that against them." A murmur spread through the crowd as the colonists realized what he was saying. They weren't just going to defend themselves. They were going to make the enemy regret ever stepping foot on this planet. Suddenly, a loud beep echoed through the square. One of the colonists, an old radio operator, rushed toward Cole, holding a battered comms device. His face was pale. "They're coming." Cole's muscles tensed. "How many?" The man swallowed hard. 2 dropships, maybe 3, heavy assault squads. The tension in the air thickened, but no one ran. No one cowered. Cole turned to the crowd. "Positions. Now." The colonists moved quickly, taking cover behind barricades, gripping their weapons tightly. Some still looked unsure, but no one hesitated. Cole took a deep breath, his fingers wrapping around the trigger of his minigun. He had faced impossible odds before, but this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. This time, he was fighting for something bigger. And as the first dropship roared through the sky, the battle for the colony truly began. The sky rumbled as the enemy dropships descended, their engines roaring like beasts hungry for destruction. Dust and debris swirled across the colony as the ships hovered above the landing zone. their metal hulls gleaming under the twin suns. From the sides, the hatches groaned open, revealing squads of heavily armed mercenaries in dark armor, their visors glowing red as they prepared to storm the settlement. Sergeant Cole watched from his position atop one of the makeshift barricades, his sharp eyes locked onto the descending forces. He counted quickly, 3 dropships, each carrying at least a dozen soldiers. Too many for a direct fight. But that was fine. They weren't here for a direct fight. Cole tapped his comm. "Hold your fire until I say." The colonists, hidden behind crates, rooftops, and ruined buildings, gripped their weapons tightly. Sweat dripped down their brows, fear clawing at their minds, but none of them moved. The enemy commander, a tall, broad-shouldered alien in polished black armor, stepped forward, his plasma rifle raised. His voice boomed through the settlement. "Enough of this nonsense. You have one chance to surrender. Lay down your weapons and accept your punishment, or be wiped from existence." Silence. The mercenaries spread out, their boots thudding against the ground as they advanced. Their fingers hovered over their triggers, scanning for movement. One of them muttered, "Why is it so quiet?" Then, in a flash, all hell broke loose. Cole squeezed the trigger. The minigun roared to life, spitting out a storm of bullets at an unimaginable speed. The first line of mercenaries barely had time to react before they were shredded, their armor crumpling like paper as the high-caliber rounds tore through them. Screams echoed as the colonists sprang into action. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds erupted from hidden positions, cutting through the confused mercenaries before they could even fire back. Explosions rocked the settlement as makeshift traps, rigged fuel barrels, and explosive charges detonated beneath enemy boots. One of the dropships, still hovering above, took a direct hit to its thrusters and spiraled out of control, crashing into the side of a supply building in a fiery explosion. Panic spread through the enemy ranks. "This isn't a rebellion. It's a damn ambush," one of the mercenaries shouted. The commander roared in frustration. "Regroup. Fall back to th." His words were cut short as a plasma round from a hidden sniper punched through his visor, sending him collapsing to the ground, motionless. Cole grinned. "Not so tough now, are you?" The remaining mercenaries, realizing they had walked into a death trap, began scrambling for cover, but there was nowhere to run. The colonists moved swiftly, cutting them down with a precision that no desperate farmers should have had. Minutes passed, and the battle that was supposed to be an easy execution for the enemy had turned into a massacre. The last surviving mercenary, wounded and gasping for breath, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "Wait, please. I surrender," he begged. Cole stepped forward, his minigun still smoking. He looked down at the alien, his expression unreadable. "You should have thought about that before you came here." A single gunshot echoed through the colony. Silence followed. The battle was over. But the war had just begun. Smoke curled into the sky as the battlefield fell silent. The bodies of fallen mercenaries lay scattered across the colony's streets, their once imposing armor now riddled with bullet holes and plasma burns. Fires crackled in the distance, consuming what remained of the crashed dropship. The scent of charred metal and scorched flesh lingered in the air. Sergeant Cole stood in the middle of the wreckage, his minigun still warm in his hands. His eyes swept across the carnage, taking in the sight of his people, bruised, bloodied, but still standing. The colonists had fought like demons, like warriors hardened by necessity, and they had won. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A young colonist, barely out of his teens, approached, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Sergeant, what now?" Cole didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the burning sky, where the enemy fleet still lingered beyond the clouds. They had only fought the first wave. The real fight was coming. He activated his comm. "Get the wounded inside. Salvage what weapons you can. We don't have much time before they send reinforcements." The colonists moved quickly, dragging the injured to shelter, gathering rifles and ammunition from the fallen mercenaries. Engineers rushed to reinforce the barricades, while others scavenged the enemy's tech, hoping to find something useful. Cole turned toward the colony's makeshift command post, a reinforced bunker near the central square. Inside, their best minds were already at work. Dr. Evelyn Hayes, the settlement's lead scientist, looked up from a cracked screen as Cole entered. "That was reckless," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Effective, but reckless." Cole smirked. "You're welcome." She sighed, brushing dust off her lab coat. "We picked up enemy transmissions. The mercenaries were just a scouting force. The real fleet is still up there, deciding whether to bombard us from orbit or send in another wave." Cole's expression darkened. "How long?" "Hours, maybe less." He clenched his jaw. They had bought themselves time, but not much. And if the enemy decided to wipe them out from orbit, there wasn't a damn thing they could do to stop it. Unless... "Did we recover anything from the dropships?" he asked. Dr. Hayes motioned toward a table covered in enemy tech. "Helmets, weapons, data pads. Their encryption is tough, but we're working on it." A grizzled ex-mercenary, now fighting for the colonists, leaned over the table. "I might have something," he said, holding up a cracked enemy communicator. "It's busted, but if we patch it into our systems, we might be able to fake a distress signal. Make it look like the mercs failed, and the colony's already destroyed." Cole nodded slowly. "Could buy us time, or we could lure them in." Dr. Hayes frowned. "You want to bring them down here? Are you insane?" Cole grinned. "We just wiped out their first team. If we make them think we're weak, they'll send in ground troops instead of glassing us from orbit. And when they land," he rested a hand on his minigun, "we make sure they never leave." The room was silent for a moment. Then the old mercenary chuckled. "I like the way you think, Sergeant." Dr. Hayes pinched the bridge of her nose. "This is madness." Cole shrugged. "No, this is survival." Outside, the colonists prepared for the next fight, unaware that the real storm was coming. And when it did, the enemy would regret ever setting foot on this planet. The colony was silent, but it was the silence before a storm. The air smelled of burnt metal and blood, the remains of the first battle still scattered across the streets. The colonists had done what they could. Barricades reinforced, weapons scavenged, and wounded tended to. But all of them knew one thing: this was just the beginning. Sergeant Cole stood on a rooftop, scanning the sky. The enemy fleet still hovered in orbit, waiting, watching. They had not fired, not yet. That meant they were still debating their next move. Good, because the colonists already had a plan. Down below, inside the command bunker, Dr. Evelyn Hayes worked furiously at the enemy communicator, her fingers flying across a keyboard. The old mercenary, Ramirez, leaned over her shoulder, watching as she hacked into the damaged system. "Almost there," she muttered. Ramirez crossed his arms. "If this doesn't work, they could bomb us into dust." "It'll work," she snapped. And then the screen flickered. A garbled voice came through the static. "Forces eliminated. Requesting urgent reinforcements. Civilian threat neutralized." Dr. Hayes smirked. There, a fake distress signal, making it sound like the mercenary team failed, but that resistance was minimal. "If they believe it, they'll send in ground forces instead of wiping us from orbit." Sergeant Cole entered the bunker, his expression grim. "How long before they respond?" Dr. Hayes hesitated. "Minutes, maybe less." Cole nodded. "Then we get ready." In the colony's ruins, the trap was set. Colonists took positions in the shadows, behind barricades, inside buildings. Snipers found perches on rooftops, their rifles aimed at the sky. Engineers planted explosives at key choke points, enough to collapse entire streets when triggered. The air was thick with tension. People whispered prayers, gritted their teeth, checked their weapons one last time. Then they heard it. The hum of incoming dropships. Cole tightened his grip on his minigun. Here they come. The enemy took the bait. From above, sleek, black dropships descended through the clouds, their engines roaring as they hovered just above the colony. Their sides opened, and heavily armed soldiers, twice as many as before, began rappelling down. The first wave hit the ground, fanning out, weapons raised. Cole watched from the shadows, waiting. The enemy thought they were walking into an easy cleanup. They thought the colony was weak, that the fight had already been beaten out of them. They were wrong. The moment the last soldier touched the ground, Cole raised his hand and dropped it. Chaos exploded. The hidden snipers opened fire first, their bullets finding targets before the enemy even realized they were under attack. Explosions ripped through the streets as the colonists detonated the traps, sending debris and fire into the sky. Cole stepped out of cover, his minigun spinning to life. Brrrred. The sound was deafening. The sheer force of the bullets tore through armor, turning enemy soldiers into shredded meat. Some tried to run for cover, but the colonists had them surrounded. Dr. Hayes and her team had hijacked an enemy turret, turning it against them. Plasma bolts rained down, cutting through their ranks like a scythe. Ramirez led a squad of colonists through the alleys, using hit-and-run tactics to dismantle the invaders from behind. The enemy had no chance. Within minutes, their formation broke. Some tried to retreat back to their dropships. But as they ran, boom! The explosives rigged inside the landing zone detonated, turning the retreating soldiers into fire and ash. The last mercenary standing dropped his weapon, his hands shaking. His helmet was off, revealing terrified alien eyes. "We surrender," he begged. "Please, we didn't know." Cole stepped forward, his gun still hot. He stared at the soldier, then at the bodies of his fallen people, the ones who had died before this war had even begun. Then he spoke. Too late. The sound of gunfire echoed one last time. The colony was silent again. The second wave was gone. The enemy fleet still hovered in orbit, but now they had no way of knowing what had happened below. Cole turned to Dr. Hayes. "Send the next message." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Do it." She took a deep breath and activated the communicator again. This time, the message was simple. Colony secured. Resistance eliminated. Preparing for extraction. It was a lie. But if the enemy believed it, they would send their final team down. And when they did, it would be the last mistake they ever made. The sky above the colony burned with the glow of the enemy fleet. Their command ships remained in orbit, watching, waiting. They had already lost 2 waves of ground forces. Now they had only one option left: send their strongest warriors, or retreat in shame. Sergeant Cole stood on the battered rooftop, watching the enemy's response unfold. The fake message had worked. They believed their mercenaries had succeeded, but instead of an extraction team, they were sending something worse. Elites. Dr. Hayes analyzed the incoming transmission. Her face paled. This isn't just another attack force. They're sending in their warlords, their best fighters. No prisoners, no negotiations. Cole smirked, checking his minigun. Then we give them a welcome they'll never forget. The last wave arrived with brutal precision. Sleek black drop pods rained from the sky like falling meteors. They struck the ruined streets with enough force to shatter the pavement. The pods hissed open. Out stepped monsters. Heavily armored warlords, each standing taller than any human, their weapons humming with lethal energy. Their helmets bore the marks of countless victories. Their movements were slow, deliberate, hunters confident in their prey. One of them, a towering brute with crimson armor, activated his comms. His voice, deep and mechanical, echoed through the ruined streets. "This world is ours. Surrender, and you may die quickly." Cole answered with gunfire. The battle was unlike any before. The elites moved like ghosts, faster than their size should allow. They dodged bullets, weaving through the wreckage, cutting down colonists with brutal efficiency. Energy blades sliced through barricades like paper. Plasma rifles melted cover in seconds. But the humans didn't break. Cole held the line, his minigun roaring as he shredded through enemy armor. Dr. Hayes directed artillery strikes from the bunker, turning entire streets into firestorms. Ramirez led a guerrilla assault, using the ruins to ambush isolated warlords. The battle raged for what felt like hours. The air filled with smoke, blood, and the screams of the dying. And then, one by one, the warlords began to fall. The colonists fought like demons, refusing to give in, until only one enemy remained. The Crimson Armored Warlord. The final duel. Cole faced him in the ruined square. Smoke drifted between them, bodies of fallen warriors scattered around. The warlord towered over Cole, his energy blade crackling. "You are strong," the warlord admitted, "but strength alone is not enough." Cole rolled his shoulders, raising his minigun. "Guess we'll see about that." The warlord lunged. Cole fired. Brrrred. The minigun roared, spewing lead at 3,000 rounds per minute. The warlord dodged, closing the distance, his blade slashing. Cole ducked, barely avoiding death. His gun overheated, useless now. The warlord grinned beneath his helmet. "You have lost." Cole smirked. "Not yet." And then the warlord heard it, the beeping of a grenade. Cole had dropped it at his feet. Boom! The explosion ripped through the warlord's armor, sending him crashing to the ground. He struggled to rise, his body broken. Cole stood over him, shotgun in hand. "This world belongs to humanity." He pulled the trigger. Victory. The last warlord was dead. The enemy fleet, watching from orbit, hesitated. Their best had fallen. Their forces had been wiped out. And now they had a choice: continue the war or flee. Dr. Hayes sent out a final transmission, one simple message directed at their commanders: "If you come again, we will bury you." Seconds passed, then minutes. And then the enemy ships turned away. The war was over. Humanity had won. The colony, though scared, still stood. The people who had once been considered weak had proven themselves unstoppable. Sergeant Cole looked at the survivors, at the smoking ruins, at the sky now clear of warships. And he smiled. They had fought. They had survived. And no one would ever laugh at humanity again.